web developer doing back-end and front-end development for about 15 years now. Today we're going to take a look at making a simple WordPress widget that displays Formio submissions. So if you're familiar with Formio, we're going to take a look. I'm just going to go back home. So in the Formio, actually let's just go Form. You know what? Okay. The Formio project, once you register for an account, you'll come into this page where you can set up a new project. We're going to do one of these sample forms today, but when you come in here, you'll have the option of using a framework like Angular or React. It's nice to see web components are coming soon. However, we're going to use Standalone Forms. So we're just going to go up. Actually, let's create a new project. So this is doesn't help that I can't spell all that well. And this sample project will be on GitHub, so you can download it and use it as you wish. Once we create the project, we'll come into this splash screen. It's going to go over essential information for the setup of your project. The one thing you want to pay attention to is this resources. We're going to be using this to authenticate against the database that it sets up when we go through these steps. The data is where you can review the form data. Your API is pretty darn important. And one nice thing about, actually the big thing about Formio is that it automatically creates a RESTful API based upon the form that you set up and the fields you select. Forms are pretty self-explanatory. You can go into the form builder inside of this web app, build a pretty nice form with a bunch of conditional logic or validation logic. Our access permissions give us a really granular ability to restrict roles and permissions through each of the forms and fields and submissions. And settings is just your settings. So we're just going to go through this real quick. And we're going to use our form. Okay, now we're going to go over to forms. And we're going to create a new form. Okay, so what we did when we created the project is come in and it created all these resources and forms for us. So we get a user login form, we get a user registration form, and we get an admin login form. On the resource side, these are the authentication databases that it sets up for us. So we can actually go into admin, see our form to add data to this repository here, and once we have data inside here, we can use that to authenticate against, and I'll show you that in a minute. Right now we're going to go and create a new basic form. We're going to use the API drag and drop form. You see this form field is pretty darn nice, one of the nicest I've used if you've used a lot of these form builders. We're just going to title this form sample form for GitHub. And it's going to display as a form. So we get an API path here, and this is the API path for our project, and this is the endpoint for our form. So we're going to go in and just put some fields in here, and we're going to say this is full name. Oops. Full name. You can add placeholders such as enter your name. We could add a description and nice little tooltip. So we get that nice little tooltip there. We can add input masks, which is nice if we need to do specific kinds of data. We can prefix, postfix, add classes, and edit the attributes that come onto the input field. So I usually handle these with JavaScript on the end user application. However, if you're just using the form, these can come in pretty handy. And we'll take a look at one of the live forms I'm using on a website development project right now. Right now we're going to save this. We're going to take a look at that a little later, I'm sorry. We're going to save this, and we're going to enter an email, and that's fine, and a phone number, and that's also fine. So one more thing to note here. If we go over here and we go to edit, and we go into API. So API will auto-generate the property name, and that's the property name that we're going to see in the body response object. So this is something we can change if you want to change this to make it a little bit easier on your life, but we're going to leave it as is. Okay, so now we have our form set up. We can go and use our form at any point, so we're just going to go here and create this. Great. So now if we go over, we have our sample form for GitHub over here. And we have a user and admin resources. So we're going to go over an admin, and one of the things we have to do is add a user to authenticate against the database. Now I'm going to use my user right here, and you'll see that if we go over to data, now I have that entry in the database for the admin resource. So we could also go and do the same thing inside of the user resource. But we're going to head over to access permissions now. Actually, we're going to go form and access. So these are all the permissions that we can assign to this form. We have different roles set up, and we're going to assign a role as administrator to reading on all the submissions. So right here, we're going to select administrator and authenticated. We can also put this to anonymous so that anyone can create a form, or an entry, I'm sorry, not a form. We could select authenticated for this one, administrator here. You don't have to add all these. Really, the only one we're going to worry about right now is read all submissions, but as you go through the API and you see that you need to do other CRUD actions, that you can come in here and assign the resources as needed. Roles and resources. So, okay, so we're good there. I'm going to go back here, go just double check our access. Okay, we're good. So we're going to go head over to API, and in the API Explorer we have the endpoints that the app automatically generates for us, and we see if we have the authentication endpoints, admin and user login and admin login. We also have a user registration form, and here's our form that we're going to worry about. So we have a form right here. Actually, you know what? Let's go and put some data in our form so that when we go and try this in our app, it'll work quickly. So if we just go over here and go back to our form, we can go to use, and we can enter a name. I'll just use my info there. I'll go back here. Well, Ted, if you're watching, I haven't seen you in about 20 years, but I don't know why your name just came to mind, but here you go. You see we get a nice input mask on the phone number. We'll add one more. Okay, so now if we go over the data tab, we'll see the data that we have inside of here. So remember, this web app is pretty resilient. We have a lot of forms and functions and features in here that we can navigate our data, add data, and do our basic CRUD operations within the UI. However, if we're building something for an end user, obviously that's probably not the best idea. It is worth noting that you can use this for a lot more than forms. You can build a whole back-end application using Formio as a platform as a service, and it helps to expedite development quickly, especially for MVP products. So we're going to take a look at the endpoints, and here at the endpoint we get this get submission. So the submission endpoint is going to be where we actually want to point our API to our AJAX or curl call to retrieve this body response. So if I'm not mistaken, okay, no, we got to go down here. So we have some parameters we can put on there, like skip and lit, pretty obvious. Sort, we could sort the records. It's obviously something we might want to do. Select, we can select using queries. So we can filter and refine data based off the queries we append to the endpoint URL. And we can also populate specific fields. We're not going to do any of that right now because we don't need to, and we just want to take in all the information inside of our little form. But be aware that if you wanted to select specific entries, you could use this endpoint with some filters on your select statement. And please reference the documents for for select query parameters, we could filter our results. So you can imagine that we can add JavaScript to make AJAX calls to go and form any kind of variation on the product data, or I'm sorry, on the information inside of that database. So if we go and try out, we're going to get a response body. We get the request URL. So the request URL contains our project API and our API endpoint, which is submission for a sample form for GitHub. Well, I put GitHub, so there's our first mistake. But that doesn't really matter, so we'll keep on moving on. In the response body, we get exactly that. We get an array of objects representing the entries inside of the database. So you see here we get some basic information. And remember, this is the response body object, so we're going to pull that property when we write our code. There is additional information in the headers, and the headers are sent back with a JWT token for authentication. And we're going to use a Formio PHP class to handle the curl. So if we go in here and we see we have a data property, and that contains an object with all of our fields and information. So that's what we'll be pulling into our application or our widget in WordPress. These are the response headers that also come in at the top. If we go and we look at, okay, this is the submission, post, but if we looked at the get for the admin portal, then we would look at the token response in the headers, and we would take that JWT token, and you know what, what is the name of that token? Yeah, JWT. So we would take that x-JWT token, and we would use it to add to the header and the request in further API pings. So what we have now is the submission endpoint. And what we want to do is we want to go in and make a simple WordPress plugin. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a new file, and we're going to save this file as save that into a folder for our plugin. So we're going to put this as sample form.io table plugin. And then in here we're going to save our sample form.io table plugin.php. Alright. So we got our basic PHP file set up, we have a simple plugin directory, and that's basically almost all we need to create a plugin. We're going to add at the top, we're going to add our PHP tags. Always important. I come from JavaScript, so I'm not a big open and closed tag person, so if you see me make a mistake, feel free to let me know. Then we're just going to make some comments here. And the first one is going to be the plugin name. So this information is what WordPress uses in the plugin directory to parse the files and register the plugins. We're going to do sample form.io plugin. And on the next line, we're going to enter a description. Please ignore the request or the errors at the bottom of my screen. I don't normally work in PHP, so I don't have a lot of the services installed that does type checking and format checking and all that great stuff like I do for JavaScript. But we're going to take it easy here, and we're going to go next for the version number. It's just going to be 1.0. And our author is Joshua Berkowitz, and that's me. And your author URI. Say HTTPS. Oops. Okay, so that's all we need to make a plugin. Once we save that, if we went over there, we could register it. Obviously, it wouldn't do anything, but it's a good start. So what we want to do next is we want to go and take a look at GitHub. And if we go back over to GitHub, oops. So if we go over to GitHub and search for Formio, we'll see a Formio PHP class kindly provided for by Formio. So we're going to use this class. It's only a single file here. So what I'm doing is I'm just copy and pasting this into a new file. Well, that's not what I wanted to do at all. Alright, so we're just going to grab that, we're going to paste it into a new file, and we're going to save this as in our plugin directory. I'm not making any subdirectories because it's just two files. Okay, now we have a PHP class for Formio. Some instructions at the top. We're going to take it easy. It's pretty darn simple. It is worth noting you can go through this class and pretty much pick apart everything that's happening here. It's pretty basic stuff. We're just adding some methods for authentication and retrieving that JWT token. And we're going to also get some get, delete, put, and post functions. We also have a checks to see if it exists. And we have the most important, the login function. We also have register if you want to add, and there's a nice single sign-on function which registers a new user and adds a standard password. I'm not going to use the single sign-on. I'm going to authenticate against the user in our database because I think it's better to show you that. And the first thing we're going to do is include our Formio PHP file. So that's our form class. So the next thing we have to do is, all we have to do actually, is we're going to create a shortcode, and that's just done by adding a function and then adding some a hook for adding the shortcode to WordPress. So let's go in here and start our little WordPress shortcode widget. So we're going to name this display. Actually, I know I'll use the same one from my GitHub page, and that's sample entries, and that's going to take no parameters. So inside here, all we want to do is we want to create a new instance of the class. So Formio, and that's going to be a new Formio, and that's going to take two parameters, two arguments. The first is going to be the API endpoint. So we're going to have to go back over to our Formio. And here is our endpoint. And next it's going to take an array of values for the resource and the login resource. So the first one is resource. Spelling is my mortal enemy. And we're going to authenticate against the admin resource. So next we're going to go and tell it to use the login located at admin login. Okay, and so if you come from JavaScript, I came from PHP and went to JavaScript development, and these semicolons drive me crazy now. But anyway, so the next thing is we just want to call our Formio function, and we're going to say that this is going to be Formio, and we're going to call the login method. And the login method is going to take two arguments. It's going to take a username and a password. So if you remember the username and password that I set up when we set up that form and entered the resource, it was info.us, and I just remembered that I used my password I use for a lot of things. So I'm going to go back over here. I'm going to change this, and I'm going to say this. I'm going to delete that. I'm going to go back in and use a simple password so that I'm not giving away my credentials. Alright, so that's all we need there. So if you head over to my GitHub page, all this will have comments behind it, and you can follow along there. It's pretty self-explanatory though. I think we're following along pretty easy. Once we have the login, we have an authentication token. Now we can make get, post, or put, or delete calls, and that's what we're going to do next. So our inquiry table is going to equal Formio, and that's the get method, and the get method is going to take one argument, and that argument is going to be the endpoint that we are looking at. So if we want to go get all the information from, all the data from our form here, what we're going to go is form, alright, API, sample form for GitHub. We have a couple get requests here, and we're going to use this top one. And that is our endpoint that we need. So let's go plug that in over here. We need to remove any / prefixes. So that's our inquiry table. So that contains all the information for our response from the API. So next we need the body of that response. So we'll call that form entries. And our inquiry tables body. So that just brings in the body of our form entries, our entries. So that body is a single property, and that property contains the objects that have the entries in them. So now that we know that, we're going to do, I'm going to walk right through to setting up a table to display these results. So I'm going to copy and paste some information here, and that's going to be the table top or table header. I don't know. I did interior design for many years, and so I say table top. So what we want to put in here is the top of our table, and that's going to just include the head of our table and some style information. All right, perfect. Now we got our tabletop. We can echo that. So now we're displaying our tabletop. And for the entries, all we're going to do is we're going to loop through them and display them as we need them. We can go and reference the form API field names for our data entries. And if we take a look, if we did a var dump right here of form entries, we would get a dump of the data properties. So we would get an array of objects containing the full name, the email, and the phone number. I'm not going to go and look at any dumps right now, so we're just going to jump into our for each loop. But if you have any trouble, using the var dump is always an easy way to take a look at what you're looking at. So inside of our for each loop, we're just going to take form entries as entry, and then we're going to build a table. So one of the things that we have inside of our body response is a created date. So that date is pretty darn useful, and we're going to format that because it comes in an unformatted string. So we're going to use date create, and that is going to be entry. Created. Again, if you look at the API response body, you'll see the created property there, and we're just going to create that and save it to a date for each of these. And then we'll format that in the table. So the first thing, we're going to open up our table row. And tr. Okay, so if we take a look at my classes up above, we're going to do a couple things. The first column is going to be td with a class equal to this. Okay, so that's our first one. That's our first row. Our second row is going to be LAX. And always forgetting my semicolons. See? There. Always forgetting them. Okay, so we have 3 rows, 4 rows. And that is the end of our row. So we'll close that out. And then we'll echo the end of our table. So inside here, we just want to put our information. So we're going to say that, well, we have the date as the first one. So we will concatenate in that information. So we're going to use date format. Nope. That's going to take the date. And we're going to format it like month, day, year. Pretty simple. And the other ones are going to follow the same procedure. And this is going to be entry, data. So those fields, we can go in, we can take a look over here. Okay, so we have phone number, email, full name, submit we don't need. Here's our created property. You can see the string we get for the date time. Alright, so that looks pretty good. So the very last thing we have to do is make sure we're outside of our function. We are. And we're just going to add the shortcode. Oop. And add shortcode. I want to say this is Formio inquiry. Same as my GitHub. And in here we just have to call the function which we created above. So we're going to say that. So every time we use this shortcode, we will get this function, which will echo back this information. So let's go and make it all happen. Alright, it's pretty easy, huh? So we're going to head over to a Wordpress, one of my many WordPress sites here, and we're going to go back here. Oops. Psh. Yay, I got it right. Alright, so we're going to head over to plugins. Make sure I don't have this installed on this one. Nope. Oh, I did. I deleted it. So there it is. Alright, so we're going to go back over and look at our Formio plugin. Actually, you know what? Where did I save this? Okay. So I'm not going to use the one off of my GitHub repository. I'm using this one because we made some changes, updated some information that you will have to update, like the endpoint URL, the username and password, and the endpoint for your submissions. So now all we have to do is hop over to our wp-content/plugins folder. And you know what? Documents. And we're going to get our sample Formio table plugin, and we're just going to drag and drop it over here. So now go back to your WordPress admin and your plugin screen, and we see this sample Formio plugin. So let's activate that. Let's also make sure I put in my class. Yep, there's my Formio class. There's my shortcode script. And if we go over to a page, we should be able to see a submission. So actually, you know what? Let's just go and add a new page so I can show you how simple this is. We're going to use a standard editor. And we're on WordPress v5, so we don't have the Gutenberg editor installed. This is sample Formio data API. And in here, all we have to do is put our shortcode. And our shortcode is what we just defined at the bottom of this script. And plug that in there, we should get voila. Oop, publishing failed for some reason. And why is that? It looks like we're getting an error on we have an error on our plugin. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back and debug that in a little bit. Okay. So this is what we get at the end of the day. I guess we didn't have an issue inside of the plugin. Maybe it's being used twice, or I used the wrong shortcode. But that's our plugin, plugin shortcode. And this is what we get on the end user. So now we have a nice little table displaying the results from our Formio data. If we go back in here, we look at the data, here's our data, go back to our WordPress, and here it is. So we could sort, filter, do anything we want with that. Works out pretty well. So feel free to let me know if you have any questions. This is obviously just a very, very simple app. And I use this type of thing very often to go and retrieve, update, modify information from numerous systems via an API. And this is just an easy way to do it inside of WordPress. So I usually use this to make back-end portals for my clients that display information are relevant to all their systems. Formio is one of our great lead capture forms, so I'm currently using it on a development, well actually it's production now, a development site here for brand lighting. This is a site I'm working on currently. And if we went over into one of our products here, we get to see the Formio in action right down here in the inquire form. So this inquire form is generated by Formio. It's dynamically updated in the fields by Formio. JavaScript handles adding the product SKU or whatever. In this case, I don't know what it's doing here. But it also adds our product name. Interesting bug I have to go look at. And that's it. So when you submit this, you would get, let's just go and submit that. The submission complete, and now that submission is stored in our database and can be retrieved on our table. So that's it. Like I said, I'm Joshua Berkowitz. I'm based out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. I do web development in PHP, web apps, database design, database infrastructure development, and pretty much anything you can name in web application development. I have a strong interest in machine learning and artificial intelligence, so if you're looking to get into Python, do some machine learning algorithm development, feel free to contact me. I'd love to learn along with you. When it comes to anything in web development world, feel free to reach out to me. I'm always willing to help and educate our friends around the world. Thank you and have a great day. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial.